This is a friendly reminder that the Open Source from Office 2023 survey is out there for people to take. So if you're engaging in any open source from Office or similar open source initiatives within your organization, or if you're thinking of, or your organization is thinking of starting one, feel free to take the survey. Right now we have it in English. The community also translated it into Japanese. And I think also the LF APAC OSPO SIG working group is working on a Chinese version that will be, I hope it will be released soon. And again, thank you so much to all our partners that are also helping us to distribute and to work on this year's survey. Another new from our Japanese working group. So they are having bi-weekly meetings from Open Chain community and Tutor community, and they're releasing a set of questions and answers for people that wants to start an OSPO, to have like common questions and answers that people might ask at the very first beginning. And this is the next meeting in case you are interested to attend. Going back to Europe, there's the new OSPOlogy European chapter will release the OSPOlogy Live, Share and Learn. This will be the 3rd edition, and this is going to be held in Germany in October, and it's going to be hosted by OSPO at ASAP. This is the draft agenda that we have so far. Also, this is the last day to review the OSPO definition 2023 release. Right now it's a PR that it's open for people to leave their comments, to leave their contributions and help and contribute to this new release of the OSPO definition. OSPOlogy is open to everyone. There are many ways you can contribute to the different repos and the different topics in OSPOlogy. And also this and other of the OSPOlogy sessions will be recorded for those ones that maybe they are on different time zones or they cannot make it on time. So you can review it later as well. So saying that, let's move to the topic of the month. And today we've got here Xiaoya from East China Normal University and Richard from Ant Group OSPO.
Well, hi everyone, my name is Xiaoya, and Anna, you have pronounced it perfectly, but I think everyone, you can also call me Yaya because I know Xiaoya is a bit difficult to pronounce. So currently I'm a PhD candidate at the East China University, and my main research focus is around open source software ecosystem sustainability. And I usually conduct mixed method research to address specific questions regarding open source developers and open source project communities. And right now, I also serve as a research intern at the Alibaba Group OSPO. And I was also highly engaged in the kiosk community to look into the metrics related to community health and sustainability. And that's all. I'm glad to be here today.
Thank you so much, Xiaoya. Richard?
Hi. Hi, everyone. Hope you can all hear me well. As you might be able to tell, I'm on a road trip, but I joined this panel anyway, since open source is always important. Okay, yeah, so again, my name is Richard Sekang Bian. I'm actually an engineer by training. Before I joined Ant Group, I've been working in the States for like 11 years with Microsoft and Square Inc., now called Block. Yeah, so working as an engineer was fun, but working on open source is a different challenge. So I joined Ant Group back in 2020, December time. And I actually joined the team called Strategy Initiative organization, which was focusing not only on open source, but on many other strategy initiatives, which can be directly helpful for our long-term technology strategies. Interesting enough, it turns out like open source was one of the pioneered technical strategy that we decided to explore in 2021, and it turns out to be an important one for us. And the initiative actually became a new challenge and new focus area. We actually built OSPO back in 2021, and I pretty much spearheaded the whole initiative. And now I'm pretty much leading a small team doing all the OSPO-related work. It's a very interesting challenge, I have to say, doing OSPO in China. we actually receive a lot of help from to-do groups documentations and the community support. But I have to say, it's more than that. Okay, that's my intro. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Richard. And coming back to how do you started the OSPO back in 2021, I'm curious to know, like, how did the champion sell the OSPO internally? And how was the value communicated? Because many people that at the very beginning wants to start the OSPO, they thought that this is the most difficult part, right?
Yeah, I will probably start that part, and Xiaoya can see if there's anything to chime in on that front, because we actually engaged pretty early as part of that process, and we receive a lot from the kiosk community as well as the metric side from Xiaoya side. Okay, so back in the old days, all I have to say is like it all begins with initiative. Initiative is like a proof of concept. So the organization was trying to figure out, open source is important. It's probably more important than focusing that only on the BU level, like business unit level. So if we do that from a company's perspective, what do we need to do? I would say the primary drivers are coming from two aspects. One is that we have real problem to solve. At that time, we have at least like 2 or 3, I would say, incident from the community, including but not limited to GitHub mismanagement and like community backfire on some of our projects because certain engineers doesn't really know the rules of the community. So we have been facing some challenges, and the challenges have unfortunately gained attention from the management team. So there was this one driver, and on the other hand, the team does look forward into seeing how we can actually leverage open source as a technical driver for our whole team, like the platform infra team, in spirit of motivating engineers to do a better job, like getting our technology to be more collaborative and open, so to speak, because any group, we have a very confined to business side of presence. So people are less familiar with, like using the business software as a driver to pretty much like spearhead the open source initiative. So that was where we begins. All I have to say is like the first half a year is extremely difficult. It's difficult for 3 reasons. One, it's very hard to get management teams, understanding of what open source is. For certain business, it might be easier. If you're doing a SaaS business, or if you're doing a like PaaS as a service, or if you're doing PaaS Plus with marketplace, with plugins, if your business model aligns with open source, that's easier. Unfortunately for any group, it's going to be a long stretch. The second challenge comes from aspect that, only, I would say among all the engineers, as we have 12,000 engineers, maybe only like 5% actually worked on open source before. So doing this bottom up is also very difficult. It's not going to be like if we do a survey among the companies and then we take the results to the management and say, hey, look at that. People actually want it. It's not like that. So the foundation is not really there either. So the top management team's understanding was not there, and the foundation was not there. How about the overall ecosystem in China? It was also at the very, I would say, early stage compared to many other countries, including but not limited to like the United States and most of the European countries, because open source has always been a focus. So it turns out to be that we need to solve our internal problem. We also need to solve the external problem. So the first 6 months was extremely difficult. I'm not lying at all. Hope that, makes someone feels better now.
Yeah, well,
I would imagine, Anna was asking that question.
Actually, what you were mentioning sounds me so familiar from other experience of people, like this cultural change, right? Like there is a need of training, a need of like how to motivate developers and non-developers to understand open source and why they should be contributing to open source. Where are the motivators for them to contribute to? And also, of course, all the external factors that maybe in specific regions might have. So I'm now gonna go back to Xiaoya, because all this is also in one of your most recent articles you published in one of the IEEE magazines. So that shares like lessons learned from Ant Group OSPO. And so you are both one of the authors from this article. So Xiaoya, can you tell us more about this initiative, like how it started and what it shows, main outcomes from there?
Yeah, sure. So this article was written back in September last year. So since then, the open source projects, tools, and metrics mentioned in that article have been actually updated a lot. And I believe it must be the same goes for the outcomes and works from the N group OSPO. And this article is, as mentioned, as Anna have said, is published in the open source expanded column of the IEEE Computer magazine, and the editor is Professor Dirk Reel, who has extensive knowledge and research in open source software. And I remember he also presented on OSPOlogy before. Yes, the title of the article clearly indicates that it discusses the practices and lessons learned from the open source program office of N Group, which is a huge Chinese tech company. And article is actually a summary and follow-up report of a panel discussion that took place at Open Source Summit North America last year, and that panel brought together employees from both the N Group OSPO and Alibaba Group OSPO. So along with academic researchers, that is my mentor actually from East China Normal University, and me myself as the moderator, to delve into the discussion of a decade of open source in China. And during that discussion, the two OSPOs shared their insights into the current state of affairs, the challenges they faced, and the best practices they've identified throughout their company's history with open source softwares. And me myself as a researcher from the academic institutions, the lab where I came from have had an extensive collaboration with these two OSPOs. So in the session, we also talked about the tool sets and data analysis services we provided, which have been utilized by both Alibaba and N Group. But in that article, I've only focused on the N Group OSPO to make it more specific. But it's worth noting that Alibaba also heavily relies on the same tools, the same metrics and data analysis, and they have their own practice and experiences that worth sharing. So in the future, I might introduce Alibaba as a new OSPO use case and discuss it in a separate article.
Looking forward to that. I think that it's really interesting, and also like sharing best practices. And I think this is also one of the core messages of OSPOlogy. Like, there's not broad template to build an OSPO, and that is why we need these use cases and best practices from different regions to understand all the diversity that an OSPO can have. In the article, you mentioned, you put together a list of best practices that you were mentioning, Shaya, but I'm curious to know if you had to choose between like the top three, what would be and why? And also I ask this to Richard, like both of you.
Yes, for this question, I think I will leave it mainly to Richard because most of the practices was summarized by him from his practical experience within the N Group. And I was actually only a recorder and a transcriber. But I do wish to elaborate a bit first on the metaphor we mentioned in that article, that how we describe the role of OSPO as a diplomat. Because most of the time, OSPO is like a channel that build the bridge internally across different departments and teams, and also externally, like one of the practices Richard have pointed out that is to that for an OSPO a practice is you need to find all the aliens, because there are many stakeholders in the open source ecosystems, like the government, the foundations, the universities, and all sort of communities. So a company who want to deal with open source can never just do it by their own, because just like solving how the open source code could be safely introduced into the company is far not enough, because you have to think about how we should contribute back and participate into the outside world, because that's how open source works. Open source is a huge, transparent, borderless world, and that's where I think OSPO should really take their functionality, that is to play a significant role to guide and manage open source strategies within organizations, to help ensure compliance, to promote internal collaboration, and to encourage community engagement. And I will leave the time to Rico.
Yeah,
that's very well said. Thanks so much, Xiaoya. I would say that among other practices, we would categorize them into two sides. One is internal and one is external. So on the internal side, the OSPOlogy is, like we have a lot of emphasis on the internal side. The typical drivers coming from two sides. One is the legal and compliance, and the other side is requirements coming from the projects. The legal and compliance is pretty straightforward, but as part of the practices, one thing I do want to highlight is the use of the metrics. So typically people actually ask the questions is, in order for us actually to be able to, do governance right, what are the primary drivers for governance, right? Because when people think about governance, people think about compliance, security. But in reality, if you kind of break down the governance, it's a governance, right? So it's like government, it's more than just, the compliance part of it. And then the nance part has something to do with, we need to enable them to be able to do this in a proper way. So having the right say is not enough. You can come to the individuals and say all the correct things, but nobody will trust you. So I would say the metrics and the tools coming from, I would say, Xiaoya and the university is primarily helpful. We actually had multiple dashboards built with the metrics, and we're actually sharing them with business unit leaders as well as the project owners, and people found that to be immensely helpful. So that's even one thing which I would like to call out, because most of the time that's the first question the leaders are asking is, how can I measure this, and how can I make sure that the measurements are correct? So that's even one practice. And then the other internal practice, which we definitely focus on, is having a deep and thoughtful knowledge with the project themselves. Because typically, I think it has something to do with the culture, but it's definitely not, only issues with the Chinese companies. Is in order for you to actually build trust, you need to be able to offer something valuable directly to the team. Otherwise, people perceive you as a team which is trying to prevent them from doing something rather than enable them to do the proper work. So that's one, I would say, danger for OSPO, right? Because OSPO is in charge of the compliance and all the, I would say, the best practices, so as all the, the red lines, as sometimes we call them. So sometimes people are kind of afraid of us, and they don't want to talk to us, right? So okay, so if OSPO kind of knows about our projects, and we actually want to kind of run away from them, because if they don't know about us, maybe we can just do this in a more free way. So that's where Xiaoya actually mentioned the alliance part. Not only are we actually building alliance with all the compliance leaders, the legals, and the security team owners, CISOs, we also need to build alliance with the project team leaders. And how are we going to be able to do that? We actually do that with systematic way, as well as the servicing way. So we actually build I would say one of the most difficult to pass open source application process within the company. So for any open source project which actually want to go out with groups, endorsement, we actually have an offline application process with a PPT template, as well as a very scrutinized process. And we have an internal board of committee with a technical oversight committee, as well as all the specialty team leaders, with several BU leaders joining the course as well, to do this offline review. And we do this bi-monthly as part of the process. People might find that to be bizarrely weird, right? So why do you do that in a very heavy way? First thing first, we don't really have that many projects because of the nature of how any group is actually doing open source. So we're actually allowed to do that, and scalable enough for us to do it. Second, it's actually adding a lot of values, because all we have been, the primary reason behind that thought process is not because we don't want this project open source. Rather, it's like DevOps, right? It's like the value of DevOps is, all software have bugs. That's a fact. So why we have like a very scrutinized and well-established DevOps process is because we want a lot of those issues to be found early. And that's why we have that process, because we actually want a lot of these kind of issues with open sourcing a project, like, our goals, our metrics actually supporting our goals. Are we actually preparing for the governance, the proper governance and the proper ways of doing the operations of the projects? We actually front load a lot of those questions at that stage. So the project can actually solve through this. And we actually do that because we actually observe some occasions that, people are actually doing open source because of their KPI requirements. And, the open sourcing project, which is now going to be long lasting, is actually causing more issues than benefits for the community. Yeah, so that's definitely one thing which I like to highlight. And on the external side, because we don't have a lot of time, so I will make it succinct. So on the external side, I think being the diplomat and to be able to communicate with the overall ecosystem is crucial. I sometimes use this kind of metaphor that, I think OSPO on the external side is like public API. Like people kind of asking that question. It's like, we already have the project teams. Why do we need OSPO? So the project teams are well-established APIs, no question asked. But sometimes when you're doing engineering design, right, it's like you realize that, your APIs might not be complete. And sometimes there's a different level of abstractions you can build on top of that to be able to better standardize things. And I feel that OSPO is probably the minimum viable API set to properly communicate with, the ecosystem, including but not limited to like To-Do Group, Linux Foundation, as well as the trial. Yeah, so that's one thing which would be, as I mentioned, the article might be a little bit old because we wrote the article last year for the practices of what we used like the year before. And now we're actually evolving a lot on that front. And and so far, I have to say that so far has been doing pretty well. And we've been seeing many other companies kind of begin building OSPOs. And we're actually not trying to push all the companies building OSPOs because, depends on the stage of your company and the stage of your project. You might or might not need it. You might need a different set of APIs. But all I can say is like this API abstraction is a pretty good one. Okay, yeah, enough said.
Thank you so much. I actually love this API, like public API way of seeing the OSPO, where the external people can be the open source community, governments, and all the stakeholders that engage with the organization and open source, ask questions and can communicate, and you give them some feedback. I love that. It's the first time that I've heard that this comparison, and I think it's great. I also great to hear that you raise the awareness of governance, because it's true that we usually talk about compliance, security, community is also really important there. But sometimes governance is the fourth pillar that people doesn't care, and is so important. And also the importance of also not looking within the organization and the limits that an organization might face, like the cultural challenge, but also the stakeholders outside, what are the government questions or barriers or legal economic issues that can maybe affect in the OSPO and the organizations overall. You also mentioned the importance of tooling and metrics to communicate in between teams. So I'm gonna go back to Xiaoya, because I know part of that of the work that has been done in Ant Group, OSPO, and also Liva, but you mentioned earlier is the tooling that you've been developing in your lab. So I'm curious to know more about this kind of tooling, what it measures and how it works.
Sure. Our lab has developed and published tools, reports, and products that are focused around open source ecosystem data, where most of them are actually empowered by one open source project named OpenDigger. So OpenDigger conducts systematic studies using data science methods, where it measures, models, and analyzes project developers and processes. And one of the valuable data assets of OpenDigger is the continuously collected global GitHub behavior logs. And Yeah, I saw Anna have sent out the repository of OpenDigger, and OpenDigger have the software dependency relationships data. So which such global data combined with some computational models and labels, this project as a data service project can quickly generate like data insights report for any project or for any organizations or any user groups. So also, it can also provide horizontal comparisons within and across organizations. That's where OSPOs they sometimes they need from time to time, and I believe we are all quite familiar with chaos metrics. OpenDigger also implements all the quantitative chaos metrics and provide out-of-box data services for any GitHub projects that they can be like quantified into chaos metrics. And because metrics they are so important that they help organizations with decision makings from a strategy perspective. However, in the same time, sometimes companies, they should be wary of just falling into the trap of just chasing numbers when quantifying their effort. So that's why OpenDigger is also committed to perform measurements from the social collaboration network perspectives, because we think the real world of open source software development is a social coding scenario where developers and projects, they are interconnected by activities and relationships. So we think OSPOs should care about the ecosystem level data in which connections and relationships they truly matter. So we also built a metric model in that is based on OpenDigger named OpenRank that is built on such social collaboration network concept to measure developers and projects, to measure developers' social influence and contribution devotion, and to also measure project and organization their technical influence. And I won't elaborate too much here due to the limited slot, but we are working on contribute this metric model into Chaos. So we might discuss OpenRank exclusively next time.
Those are really great news. Looking forward to it. Yeah, I didn't know that, and that looks interesting. So yeah, I'm also aware of time, so I will go ahead and ask one of the last questions that I think it's interesting to ask, because we always talk about best practices, like OSPO best practices and how to do things the right way or the best way possible. But it's hard to think about anti-patterns or bad practices. So I was wondering if you have experience or seen any anti-patterns, not in your organizations, but in general, that you have been seeing in other OSPOs or in the open source ecosystem that you would like to raise here, like maybe one or two anti-patterns that you would like to discuss.
Yeah, maybe I'll just chime in with my 2 cents here. So I think, as I mentioned, most of our practices are kind of coming from internal and external side. On the internal side, I think there's the one observable anti-pattern is trying to use one metric to rule them all. Yeah, so we do hope such a world exists. And of course, sometimes, if you kind of comes to business, sometimes you can use revenues and costs to abstract a lot of things. But for open source, I have to say that most of the time for different projects at different stages, the metrics should be different. That's number one. And in order for us to facilitate a project to be successful, it also has something to do with the situation of the project within the company. So even for the same kind of project, for instance, like front-end frameworks, sometimes it's not like, most of the time, we want a lot of users, but do we need a lot of contributors? Depending on the situations, I would say that most of the time it has something to do with the business goals, because after all, if you look at the project, right, the project is code at its heart, and then there's communities among the code. And communities can be recruited by a particular company, or it can be freelancers, or it can be students, as on, etc. But there is, I would say that, like given we have a lot of projects which are actually open source by the company, by the end group. So the governance, we do have a very diverse communities, but most of the, the contributors are actually coming from internal. Being able to having the internal contributors kind of like do things in open source way is definitely important. And sometimes it's going to take some effort for the developers to understand, the open source way doesn't fully align with their internal KPIs, and being able to communicate that KPI and OKR in a way which can benefit the product for the long term. I think that's definitely going to be important, but it also takes time. So for instance, we've seen projects, originally set up with a goal to generate revenue at a very early stage. But we all know that, project need to reach its project community fit first, before it reaches its product market fit, before it reaches its product value fit, which means that, people only pay you money at that time. So having set that goal very prematurely is probably going to be jeopardizing the community more than helping. Yeah, so that's definitely one of the anti-patterns I've seen on the project side. And on the community side, one anti-pattern I've observed is not being able to listen holistically what the community really want. Because open source has a lot to do with cross-cultural collaborations. Looking at the audience, I'm seeing people from different cultural groups, and that's the beauty of open source. But sometimes for people who are actually not participating enough in open source, we occasionally observe that when they actually participate in society, they tend to put a lot of, I would say, emphasis on what they want to do rather than what others was talking about in order to reach a consensus. So not being able to think in a, I would say, consensus way, and not being able to really get the idea about what others was really talking about was another anti-pattern I observed. Because listening is hard, right? It's like sometimes we're kind of like saying that you're not listening, you're really just waiting for your turn to speak. And unfortunately that still kind of happens in many of the communications. Has nothing to do with culture, it has something to do with personality. And if you're open-minded enough, there are many other, I would say, factors associated with that, which is not very culture related. So internally we do actually have practices to try to solve those anti-patterns, and we're trying to do some, I would say, effort in order to reduce the effect of that. But those two, given the time constraints, I'll probably just share those two because those are something which I see recurrently happening.
That's really interesting.
Right,
actually, sometimes I think open source also has to deal a lot with psychological topics, sometimes it's we need to, or the OSPO should be acting as a therapist sometimes.
Right.
So to some people, it's really, really interesting. Sarah, do you have any anti-patterns on mind?
Yeah, I have, but I'm not as experienced as Richard because he's a real practitioner with his practice within the end group OSPO. But one of my biggest feelings during my research around OSPO and also during my internship at Alibaba OSPO is that sometimes OSPOs could easily become rigid rule makers, because the function and nature of the OSPO team is very horizontal. Without aligning with the need of specific business teams of open source projects, the rules and processes we establish may be arbitrary and then fail to address the actual problems. So in such cases, we might simply just creating complications instead of really solve the underlying issues. And I've actually witnessed such cases within Alibaba because Alibaba is a really huge company and it has business and technology demands across very different areas. And in such context, it makes OSPO difficult to be close to every business teams. So sometimes we don't get to know the need of developers from different departments, from different technical stacks, and sometimes unreasonable regulations and the processes and standards might just come out without notice. Nevertheless, from my perspective, OSPO should always keep in mind that we are not rule makers. We are here to provide service, to really help developers and to help open source project success. So just don't create over strict rules and regulations that stifle the creativity and flexibility of developers. It's important to find a balance between compliance and also fostering a collaborative and innovative open source culture. And that's all.
Thank you.
I just want to maybe quickly add a one-liner for that. Remember at the very beginning, I was kind of saying some projects was kind of afraid of talking to us. It's because they have sometimes, they might have this kind of stereotypical thoughts that, the OSPOs are the rule makers rather than the service providers. And changing that. And I mean, after learning a lot of practices from, maybe the old generations from some of the other, I would say, companies at a particular stage, I began understanding why. So there are definitely projects we have been experiencing the opposite, unfortunately. But all I can say is we are definitely trying to be, pioneering the new ways of doing things. And for Andy Group and Alibaba, and we are, as far as I know, we are trying our best to be able to, kind of trailblaze a new way. And definitely, want to do things in a proper way to help the project owners to be able to, success for the, in the long term. And we're trying to do that from a company's level rather than the project's level. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're already out of time. So saying that, thank you so much and hope to see you in the next OSPOlogy meeting. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
For the opportunity.